When Mirror's Edge Catalyst was released in 2016, it was considered to be a soft reboot for the franchise. Although there were mixed feelings from the developmental team and even management at DICE along with Electronic Arts about rebooting the original 2008 game. Even after the release of Catalyst, the game polarized critics and gamers just as much as the original, or even more so in the years or decades since its release. But the speculative scenario is this. The premise of Mirror's Edge was ahead of its time. The 2008 original Mirror's Edge and 2016 reboot revolved around the concept of parkour, or free running in the English language, as parkour originated in France from the early to mid 1990s. While the concept of Mirror's Edge were inspired by the chasing and escaping scenes from James Bond and even Jason Bourne films of the early 2000s, it can be argued that the entire emphasis of using parkour in games existed before Mirror's Edge. But Mirror's Edge itself was one of the first games where developers intentionally had the entire experience to be related to and emphasizing freerunning. DICE wanted to develop a gaming franchise that was different from the Battlefield brand that the studio was known for, as producers for the game announced it in 2007, and ultimately when it was released in 2009, critics and players were ultimately impressed with the sort of game that was presented in such a short amount of time. When the game was released, it received positive feedback for the premise of parkour, though the characters, story and mechanics of the game polarized those who had experienced it. In the time since its release, it was later re-evaluated as ahead of its time, and in some respects, it was considered to be a better gaming experience than the first reboot from 2016. Nearly 10 years later, a soft reboot was made for the franchise. From information now known, related media helped to keep interest in the concept of parkour from Mirror's Edge, and was intentional to help the gaming population react more positively to the franchise's soft reboot. Upon its release, it polarized critics and gamers with equal amounts of praise and criticisms. Opinions on the game were so divisive that it led to discussions on theories mentioning that the original Mirror's Edge was an underrated game and a definitive experience for video games in the late 2000s. Details of the 2008 game or 2016 game were said to have been better experiences or updated concepts when in comparison to one another. And critics or gamers had sentiment with details going back and forth, with a particular game being better or worse when in comparison to the other. With everything considered, the free running depicted in Catalyst was also something of debate. Some considered the running from 2008 to be a more faithful depiction of parkour, but limited by gaming dynamics of the time, while the 2016 version held the running to be a source of interpretation, with some preferring the game's dynamics being superior to the 2008 version, while others preferred the details of the 2008 dynamics rather than the 2016 version. Discussions or even debates about the very premise of the game naturally harder that, if it were done properly, was a source of contention from the time on since. Those who argued against the free running premise made arguments that the depiction of free running couldn't be done at the time properly. This was why, in especially the 2016 interpretation, there were side quests on collectible challenges to add an extra scope of running for players, instead of it just being repetitive to proceed through the game itself, as further arguments had it to be naturally repetitive, naturally frustrating, or even a forced experience. Those who argued for the free running premise had it that it was done differently than what was already available for gamers to experience at the time, and encouraged players to simply explore the surroundings that they were in, and speculations had it to be the very reason why a person would decide to experience such a game, to simply run through the environment as quickly or effectively as possible and to experience what could or might happen.